Friends, this is Freedom Express. I am V.K. Tripathi. In last 8 episodes, we have been discussing the impact of science on society. We have been talking about India, China, and a few other countries. Today, I would like to talk to you about Africa, which is the richest continent on the earth. From the perspective of resources, they have resources like uranium, minerals like uranium, gold, copper, iron, and so on. Very rich in resources. Still being the poorest because these resources are not controlled by the natives. Majority of these resources are controlled by foreign powers or businessmen or multinational companies abroad. So the entire wealth of these nations is sucked by outside world. Today, African continent has 55 nations. Total population is around 1.4 billion, which is roughly the same as that of India. Very significant part of Africa is desert. On the north lie 4 major countries by the side of Mediterranean that separates Africa from Europe, and these countries are Algeria, with a population of about 4.5 crore. This is a very civilized country. I visited this country 4 years ago, and I was surprised when I visited the University of Science and Technology with a student population of 40,000. I asked the professors, what is the population of teachers here? They said around 1,500. I asked, what is the percentage of women professors? They said 50%. What is the percentage of students, girl students? I was told 55%. It's very advanced from the perspective of women education. I visited their Center for Advanced Technology. There are 200 employee scientists over there. Half of them are women. They are organized by talk over there, and their understanding of plasma physics was excellent. So African countries are not the primitive societies. They are fairly advanced when they are given opportunities. So Algeria is one country, Morocco is another one, then there is a Libya, which is an oil-rich nation, and then there is Egypt. So these are the northmost countries. And then in the southmost bottom country is South Africa, where Gandhiji went in 1893 and he spent 22 years over there. So this country is very rich in minerals, as well as the land is very fertile for sugar cane, and consequently there are a lot of sugar mills in that area. In the middle of Africa lies a very important country called DR, or Democratic Republic of Congo, with a population of about 9 crore. Then there are 2 major countries, Nigeria with a population of about 20 crore people, and Ethiopia with 11 crore people. So these are big countries population wise. Egypt has a population of 10 crore. South Africa has a population of 6 crore. Then there is Tanzania with a population of 6 crore. And these countries have produced great leaders because when the freedom movements developed over there in the 20th centuries, they produced great leaders. Nelson Mandela, all of you know, was the leader of freedom struggle in South Africa, which gained independence from Britain or British regime in 1996 or so. Congo has been in the news for a great struggle led by Patrice Lumumba. Unfortunately, I think before I delve into the freedom struggles, let me tell you a little bit about the situation in African countries when the modern science arrived. Modern science, as I mentioned to you earlier, can be considered to be beginning with the invention or development of steam engine in 1776. Around that time, maybe about 200 years prior to that, African countries were unfortunately targets for slave trade. African countries would purchase human beings from here and supply them to other countries. In 1776, which is a very important landmark year in human history, when great navigator Columbus sailed through the Atlantic Ocean in search of sea route to India, he landed in America. So 1492 was the year when Columbus landed over there. Around the same time, Vasco da Gama wanted to search another route, so he went around the African continent and came to India, and some part of his delegation went to Macau in China. So these were the great expeditions for exploring water or sea routes to different destinations. Unfortunately, Africa during this period, from 1550 onwards, was known for slave trade. Nearly 400 kilometer long western strip of Africa was destination for a lot of European people, and about 4 million people were enslaved and sent to America, Brazil and Caribbean for sugar plantation. When Columbus arrived in America, in subsequent years, they needed manpower to work in farms, on fields and in mines. So they brought slaves from Africa, purchasing human beings, and kept them under subhuman conditions for decades and centuries. In 1780, the demand for, because in 1776 America got independence from British, and by 1780 the demand for slaves increased, and roughly 15,000 or more new slaves were required every year. So the slave trade continued in Africa to US and other countries. Well, in 1885, Belgium colonized Congo, a very large country in Central Africa. Well, it is this country which has a very mineral-rich state called Katanga. So when industrial revolution when the modern industry was developing in Europe, they required iron, they required oil or fuel, and they required raw material, whether it belongs to mines or it belongs to farming, and then they required markets. So when this new phase of colonization continued, different Asian countries, for instance in South Africa, the Dutch arrived first, but later British arrived. They colonized that country. Congo was colonized by Belgium, and for 75 years or even more around that time. But then, and similarly, Algeria was colonized by French, some countries were colonized by Germans. So the entire African continent was colonized. Egypt was colonized by Britain. Earlier it was a part of Ottoman Empire, but then British took control over it. So this entire region was colonized and ruthlessly exploited. Later on, when oil became important, then all the oil-rich nations became a special target for enslavement and exploitation. So while in the beginning of 20th century, Albert Einstein, for instance, came up with a special theory of relativity. Few years later, great explorations and understanding the structure of atom were developed. Nuclear physics was developed. Quantum mechanics was evolving. But for African continent, the countries were subjugated continuously and repressed vigorously. So that was the contradiction between the evolution of science and treatment meted out to people of large continent. Similar was the fate of people in Asia, but probably not that extent of exploitation or enslavement that people are being sold as slaves. So we were a little better off than Africa. So that was 18th century, 19th century and early part of 20th century. In 20th century, in 1914, First World War started, primarily as a rivalry between colonizing powers. On one side was Britain and its allies, on the other side was Germany and its allies. The war continued for nearly 5 years, killing about 5.5 crore people. Casualties were not that many. Well, there were very large number of casualties in Africa also, but not on top. But the repression continued. Around the same time, freedom movements also started. A major consequence of First World War I was that Ottoman Empire was disintegrated and majority of those countries were taken over by Britain. Tanzania, for instance, was taken over by Britain. Britain were also a power in South Africa. France was controlled by, France controlled Algeria. So different colonizing powers controlled different nations. But the freedom movements also developed after World War I in many of these countries. During World War II, well, I would like to mention one thing. In the beginning of 20th century, in 1901 or 1903, in that period, Wright brothers came out with flying aeroplanes. And by 1914, when the First World War started, they had fighter planes, but not fairly advanced, but they were used in warfare, not to large extent, but to some extent. But in Second World War, air power was fairly developed, radar was developed, and consequently Second World War used air warfare. Aeroplanes, fighter aeroplanes were used in World War II, and it was very devastating. So Second World War nearly killed 8.5 crore people across the world. Indian soldiers also perished in large numbers in World War I and also in World War II. So that was the situation here. But African countries expected that after the war is over, Second World War is over, just like India expected that when the war is over we will gain independence, we are likely to gain independence. And many Asian countries gained independence, but it was not allowed to African countries. They had to continue their struggle for a longer period of time. Algeria, for instance, gained independence after a very bloody, repressive onslaught on people by the French government. 1.5 million people were killed in their freedom struggle. So by 1963 or so, Algeria got independence from France. Today when we see some problems in Europe and France and we attribute them to Muslims, I think we should understand that these Muslims are not aliens. They were part of the French imperial power. Many of them moved during that period of enslavement to France. They deserve the right to live with equal rights. Unfortunately, they are not given those rights. And this kind of discrimination, racial discrimination or religious discrimination, is a part of imperial or imperialist design. So I think we should always keep in mind when we talk about developing countries or African or Asian countries that the colonizing powers did not treat them as human beings. They treated them as slaves, untouchables. Apartheid was practiced and is well known in South Africa, but not only there, in all countries it was practiced. So they were repressed, their resources were exploited, and even today, for instance, Lumumba, in 1960, Congo got independence from Belgium. And Patrice Lumumba was a very popular leader over there. He became prime minister. But when he said that we are independent but really not completely independent because our resources, our mines are controlled by outside companies. So we have to get control over them. Then United States and Belgium conspired to overthrow him, and he was brutally killed by the new rulers over there. And so in subsequent years, ethnic antagonism was developed to such an extent that nearly 3.5 million people died in ethnic violence. There is a country called Rwanda. There, as late as in 1995 or so, massive violence erupted between Hutus, which are a majority community, and Tutsis, which are a minority community. And nearly 800,000 people were killed in a small country like Rwanda. So Africa has been a playfield for imperialist powers, and they created ethnic or racial animosity, and that led to massive violence in many countries. But I think I would still suggest to African people that please, whatever has been the cause of disaffection between communities, come together. Salvation of third world countries, salvation of masses of third world countries lies in transcending prejudice, in transcending ethnic rivalries. We are all same race. Entire human race is considered to be originating from South Africa. All of us are the same civilization. All human beings are same. The soul of human beings connects them to each other. I wish that these 200 or 300 years of conflict and repression should not overburden our minds, that we cannot see fresh. Whatever has happened in the past should not detract us from coming close to each other. Not only close to each other in our own countries, but our neighboring countries as well as countries in Europe, in America, in Asia. All people are same. And I think let's evolve the science that does not repress one section to make another section more affluent and more powerful. I think all resources of the world must be utilized in providing education, sustenance, and growth to all sections of societies, all nations. We are a common human civilization. I am very pleased that I could talk to you on this issue today. Thank you.